She died on a Tuesday and nobody noticed for 3 days. That's what haunted me most as I stood in her cramped studio apartment, surrounded by social workers and police officers speaking in hushed tones. The tea kettle still sat on the stove, half filled with water she'd never boiled. A crossword puzzle lay on the kitchen table, only 3 words completed. Tuesday's newspaper rested beside it, folded neatly to the obituaries section, a habit of the elderly, I'd learned, reading about everyone else's death while their own crept closer. I was just the landlord's daughter, sent to collect November's rent. I wasn't supposed to become the last person to care that Eleanor Hartman had existed at all. The officer said it was peaceful, as if that detail would comfort me. As if peaceful mattered when you died alone. When your last breath dissipated into an empty room with no one to witness the moment, a whole universe of memories and dreams simply ceased to exist. I nodded and signed whatever paperwork they pushed in front of me, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the pen. I'd seen her every month for 2 years, collecting that rent check. Always the same exchange. She'd answer the door in her faded pink cardigan, hand me an envelope with my father's name written in careful cursive, and offer me tea I never stayed to drink. Too busy, I'd say, already backing toward the stairwell. Maybe next time, Mrs. Hartman. There would be no next time. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her apartment, about the life contained within those 4 walls that would be boxed up and discarded by strangers. At 2 a.m., I did something I can't fully explain. I drove back to her building, let myself in with my father's master key, and sat in her living room in the dark. Moonlight streamed through the thin curtains, illuminating a life I'd never bothered to see. Photographs covered every surface, a young Eleanor in a nurse's uniform, standing proud outside a hospital. Eleanor on her wedding day, laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. Eleanor holding a baby, her face transformed by a joy so pure it hurt to witness. I picked up frame after frame, studying the woman I'd reduced to a monthly transaction. There were letters, too, bundled in ribbons and stacked in a shoebox. I knew I shouldn't read them, but I couldn't stop myself. They were from soldiers, dozens of them, thanking Nurse Hartman for saving their lives in Vietnam, for holding their hands through the worst moments any human should have to endure, for writing letters to their mothers when they couldn't hold a pen themselves. "You're the reason I made it home," one wrote. "You're the reason I believed in goodness again." The baby in the photos, I found her death certificate in the same box. Sarah Hartman, age 7 months, SIDS. There were sympathy cards, hundreds of them, and a journal filled with Eleanor's grief, raw and devastating. The last entry was dated 30 years ago. I don't know how to be a person anymore, but maybe I can still be useful. I cried then, really cried. Sitting on the floor of a dead woman's apartment at 3 in the morning, I cried for Eleanor Hartman, who'd saved countless lives and lost the one that mattered most. I cried for the decades she'd lived in that apartment, the silence that must have pressed against her like a physical weight. I cried for every time I'd rushed past her, too absorbed in my own supposedly important life to spend 30 minutes drinking tea with someone who had no one else. But mostly I cried because I saw myself reflected in her future. At 28, I'd convinced myself I was too busy building a career to waste time on meaningful connections. I collected acquaintances like Eleanor had collected rent checks, superficial, transactions that cost nothing and meant less. I told myself I'd slow down later, connect later, live later. Eleanor taught me that later doesn't always come. When my father stopped by the next morning to oversee the estate clearance, he found me asleep on Eleanor's couch, surrounded by photo albums. He didn't ask questions, just sat beside me and looked through them too. "I didn't know any of this," he said quietly, studying a picture of Eleanor, receiving a commendation from the Veterans Administration. "She lived here for 18 years. I took her rent every month. I didn't know." The guilt in his voice mirrored my own. We'd been collectors, not connectors. We'd seen Eleanor as Unit 3B, not as a human being with a history that mattered. "We're having a funeral," I said. It wasn't a question. My father looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "She has no family. The state will handle—" "No." I was surprised by the force in my own voice. "She deserves better than that. She deserves to be remembered." I spent the next week doing something that terrified me. I connected. I tracked down every person mentioned in those letters, Every soldier Eleanor had nursed back to life. Most were in their 70s now, scattered across the country, but I found them. I told them about Eleanor Hartman, about how she'd died alone, and asked if they'd want to know when we held her service. The responses came flooding back, each one cracking my heart open a little wider. They'd been looking for her for years. These men, wanting to thank her properly, to introduce her to the families. They'd built because she'd given them the chance to build them. She disappeared after the war, retreated into her grief, and they'd never stopped, wondering what happened to the angel in the blood-soaked ward who'd promised them they'd make it home. The funeral was supposed to be a small affair at the city's cheapest funeral home. I'd planned to pay for it myself, a private act of penance. But when I arrived that Saturday morning, the parking lot was full. Inside, over 60 people had gathered, many in their mid-70s, some in wheelchairs, several with oxygen tanks. They'd come from Florida and Oregon, from Texas and Maine, these elderly veterans who'd traveled across the country to honor a woman they'd never forgotten. They told stories I'll remember until my own final breath, how Eleanor had sung to them during surgeries when anesthesia was scarce, how she'd written to their sweethearts, back home when they were too injured to hold a pen, how she'd held Private Rodriguez while he died, whispering lies about how his mother was on her way, because she couldn't bear for him to leave the world feeling alone, how she donated most of her paycheck to help soldiers' families, living on almost nothing herself. "She saved my life twice," said a man named Robert Crenshaw, leaning heavily on his grandson's arm, once on that operating table in Da Nang, and once 20 years later, when I was ready to give up on everything. I tracked her down, told her I couldn't live with what I'd seen. She talked to me for 6 hours straight, reminded me that surviving meant something, that the people who didn't make it would want us to live fully enough for all of them. He paused, wiping his eyes. I named my daughter after her. Eleanor's a doctor now, works with veterans. She's here today. A young woman in the front row raised her hand, tears streaming down her face. After the service, as we stood by Eleanor's grave, Robert Crenshaw pressed something into my palm. It was a pin, the kind nurses wore in Vietnam. "She'd want you to have this," he said. "You gave her what she gave us. You made sure she wasn't forgotten. You made her matter." "She always mattered," I whispered. But I understood what he meant. Mattering and being remembered aren't the same thing. Eleanor had mattered intensely to these men, but she died believing herself forgotten. I kept that apartment for 3 more months, paying the rent myself while I figured out what to do with Eleanor's legacy. I couldn't let it be boxed up and discarded. So I created the Eleanor Hartman Connection Fund, using the donations from the veterans and matching it with money. I'd been saving for a car I didn't really need. The fund helps isolated elderly people, connecting them with visitors, funding social programs, making sure others don't die alone the way Eleanor did. But the real change was personal. I stopped collecting and started connecting. I learned my neighbors' names, their stories, their histories. I started actually drinking that tea when offered, sitting in kitchens and living rooms, bearing witness to lives that would otherwise pass unnoticed. I called my grandmother every week instead of on holidays. I volunteered at the nursing home downtown, reading to people who rarely had visitors. Eleanor Hartman taught me that every person contains multitudes, decades of love and loss, of courage and regret, of moments that mattered deeply even if no one was watching. She taught me that being busy is just the excuse for not being present, that the work of truly seeing each other is the most important work we'll ever do. Sometimes I still go to her grave. I tell her about the fund, about the people we've helped, about the connections we've made in her name. I tell her I'm sorry I didn't see her when she was alive, but I promise I'm seeing everyone else now. I'm looking at people, really looking, recognizing the universe of experience behind every face I pass. She died on a Tuesday and nobody noticed for 3 days. But she'd lived 74 years of courage and compassion. And now hundreds of people know her name. Her story ripples outward through every person the fund helps, through every connection made in her memory, through every moment someone chooses presence over busyness. We all die eventually. The question Eleanor left me with is this: will we live in a way that makes our absence felt? Will we connect deeply enough that our presence mattered? Will someone someday fight to make sure we're remembered? I think about that every time I slow down, every time I say yes to tea, every time I choose to truly see another human being. Eleanor Hartman saved dozens of lives in Vietnam, but she saved mine too. She saved me from sleepwalking through my own existence, from reaching the end and realizing I'd never really been there at all. She was a hero, a heartbreak, a lesson, a legacy. She was Eleanor. And now, finally, the world knows who she was. Not Unit 3B, not the woman who died alone, but her, the one who proved that it's never too late to be seen, to matter, to be remembered for the love we gave when we thought no one was watching.